I want to thank my colleague, Coll Thrush, for joining us today. This is part of our little series where we're investigating historical scholarship that pertains to islands or the social and other histories of just off the coast of the Pacific coast here. So thanks, Coll.
You bet. Happy to be here.
All right. I love your background.
Thank you.
Very fitting. So let's just start off with a very general kind of biographical, backdrop for you. Tell us a little bit about your background, your training, and what you teach at the University of British Columbia.
Well, I'm a historian of, I was trained in the history of the American West with a primary interest in environmental and indigenous histories. And my first book was called Native Seattle, and it was based on my dissertation, which I did with John Finley and Richard White at the University of Washington. And when that book came out in around 2007, I got inspired to push that idea of telling a city's story through indigenous experience a little further. And so I ended up working for about 10 years on a history of London framed through the experiences of indigenous travelers, which was a really fascinating project, a lot of fun. Took me back to the early 16th century, which was a very new thing for me. And then I was working on a book about my hometown. I wanted to really come back to the Northwest, and I'm from a place called Auburn near Seattle, and was working on a book on historical trauma, looking at 4 terrible things that happened there, one of which was the Green River Killer case, which I grew up in the middle of. And summer of 2018, I got access to 7,000 pages of testimony from the Green River Killer, and kind of did me in. And I realized I don't want to write this. It was just really, really grim. So I was kind of stuck without a project. And then I was at a gathering of environmental historians down at the mouth of the Columbia River, and saw this picture on the wall of something called the Graveyard of the Pacific, which is an area of about 3,000 shipwrecks on the Oregon, Washington, and BC coasts. And I had been fascinated with those stories growing up and knew a lot of them. And I thought, what about that? And so that's my new project. It's called Wrecked. I'm not sure about the subtitle yet. It's either Ecologies of Failure in the Graveyard of the Pacific or Navigating the Past in the Graveyard of the Pacific. But it's a completely new thing. It's under contract now, and I'm on sabbatical, so I'm diving right in.
Wow, literally.
Yeah, so to speak. Yeah. There's a lot of puns that come out with it.
I bet. Well, it sounds so liberating after the kind of horrors of the Green River Killer work. So I'm pleased for you. So I do want to talk about this subtitle issue, because I think Ecologies of Failure is so tantalizing as a set of concepts, whereas Navigating the Past is, more of the pun, etc. But not, obviously a useful subtitle. Talk to me a little bit about the concept of Ecologies of Failure with the shipwrecks.
Well, it comes from a number of different streams of conversation that have been happening. One comes from the last decade or so that I've spent really involved in Indigenous studies, where there's a lot of emphasis on survivance and on resilience and these sorts of concepts. And so I've been listening to a lot of that to think about histories that are not just trauma focused, and to think about continuity and things. And then another place is the scholarship on imperial history with people like Anne Stoller, who have been talking a lot in recent years about the fragilities of empire and the kind of the cracks in the colonial structures. And often that scholarship is inspired by, the practice of wanting to dismantle those ongoing structures of, for example, settler colonialism. And so as I started thinking about shipwrecks, which just on their face were an interesting subject for me, I started thinking about what does it mean if we try to tell the story of colonialism in this region as the story of something that didn't work. It didn't work both in the sense that Indigenous peoples are still here, but also in the sense that the sort of eternal abundance that was supposed to be part of the settler colonial project hasn't worked out.
Right.
And so the ships that I'm writing about, like the one behind me here, which is the Peter Iredale on the northern Oregon coast, it wrecked in 1906 without loss of life. I've been thinking about what if we told the region's story as a story of something that wasn't successful, that didn't work. And I think it's a particularly fruitful time in our history to be thinking about that kind of thing as we think about the Anthropocene or whatever we want to call our moment. And so it's just an opportunity to try to reframe this region's history in a different way.
It's fascinating. So I want to placehold here a little bit of a concept to maybe come back to, which is the press on settler colonialism into almost sailor colonialism or something.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about taking that concept into Oceania in that way. But just give us a little background of this graveyard. So, obviously sailing either at the mouth of the Columbia or in the Pacific where you are, dangerous, difficult, etc. Tell us a little bit about the background of the difficulty of this this passage, and also what's your chronological boundaries for the project?
Yeah, well, so the graveyard is, again, the BC, Oregon, and Washington coasts, and it's got two kind of real sticking points. One is the bar at the mouth of the Columbia River, which is notoriously dangerous, and then the other is the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which ships seem to have missed all the time, and instead they run into the coast of Vancouver Island or Cape Flattery or whatever. And so there's between 2,000 and 3,000 shipwrecks in that region. So it's one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the world. And in terms of temporal boundaries, the earliest wreck that's dated that I'm going to be working with is in 1693, and it's a Manila galleon that was wrecked on the Oregon coast, carrying, among other things, a shipment of beeswax, which continues to wash ashore in that part of Oregon and has become part of local folklore. Yeah, and there were some researchers that just recently were able to determine which ship it was. It was the Santo Cristo de Burgos from Manila. So, but there are also other earlier ships, Japanese ships that got caught in the current and came around and wrecked and so on. So it goes back into really pretty shadowy history. And then I think the most recent one I'll be looking at is, in any depth, is a wreck called the New Carissa, which was a tanker that wrecked on the Oregon coast in 1999. And all of it spilled a lot of fuel, and the rest of the fuel was burned off using napalm, and it was this very dramatic moment. And using that to think about it, it was an empty tanker that broke apart on the coast, and the emptiness in that hold was really valuable. And that there's something about late capitalism there, and what does it mean to have this massive ship that has nothing in it being so valuable?
Right.
So,
amazing.
Yeah, there's a lot of metaphor here.
Yeah, and such a broad chronological, coverage. I mean, that's really daunting and impressive all at once.
Yeah.
So tell, this sort of late capitalism notion, tell us a little bit about whether or not the project takes in things like maritime insurance and, coverage of goods, et cetera. Does you pick up those threads as well?
I'm thinking it probably will, and thinking about how settler colonial societies, whatever we want to call them, how they navigate risk and how they think. And I'm a cultural historian. I'm not a legal historian or a maritime historian per se. So I'm really interested more in kind of the cultural valences of these kinds of events. How wrecks like the one behind me feature in local memory and tourism and really sense of place. So it's really that kind of work that I'm most interested in, but that is inherent in that is the stuff around loss and insurance and really I guess what I'm interested in is how stories of loss, trauma, death become ways for non-Indigenous people to lay deeper claims to a place. To essentially say,
interesting. By way of grief and other
way of grief and saying we suffered for this place.
So it's ours.
Yeah, so it's ours. And it's similar in that respect to ghost stories, which I've worked on before. But we can also think about stories like the Oregon Trail, and the
Donner Party. Donner Party has the same kind of notion of loss, therefore claim.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm quite interested in those things, but also I'm interested in how stories about wrecks continue to persist in Indigenous communities all up and down the coast, and how those stories can be mobilized in the present as ways to say, no, this is our place because we saw you wreck yourself on our beaches.
Exactly. And do the Indigenous communities have their own stories of their own wrecks of presumably smaller vessels, but are there stories of that?
Yeah, it's something that I'll be looking into. I mean, I'm really just in the earliest phases of this, but but just from what I know of the ethnographic record and the story collections that are out there from previous research, it's not a major focus in those stories. It doesn't have the same kind of cultural purchase in the way American and Canadian stories of shipwreck have. They have that kind of, there's almost a mythic piece there that gets engaged in these stories. But I may find more than I know about right now.
Sure. So in the thousands of these wrecks, is there a through line in the sense that a great many of them, the captains, they're lost. They're actually not, they don't know where they are in terms of navigating the hazards. Is there that piece of it?
Yeah, there's that. There's just the unpredictability of weather. There's mistakes that are made, and so on. Ships that run into each other and then sink, and things like this. And so one of the things I'm trying to do too is to try to write from the water a little bit. And so right now I'm thinking a lot about oceanic writing, and some of my interlocutors in that are people like Apele Haofa, RC of Islands, of course David Igler's work, and so on. And just thinking about how might we reorient ourselves in relationship to the coast.
Exactly. I mean, I with your background there, I'm assuming that the vantage point is the wreck, and then the coastal landform is looking east.
Yeah, for sure. Although I'm being really honest about the fact that I'm not a sailor. I'm not, I wasn't a merchant marine. I wasn't in the Navy. I'm not a boat guy, so to speak. And so the first chapter that I'm starting to work up right now is called A View from the Shore. And so I'm being kind of honest about the fact that I'm not really a water guy, but I'm a guy for whom the coast, which is this incredibly porous space that's neither land nor water, I'm a guy for whom that place has been really integral to my own life. So the opening chapter is really a lot about my own memories.
Yeah, no, that concept of neither land nor water is something I would love graduate students to contemplate, that literal band, along the Pacific coast, or 20 miles out and 20 miles in.
Yeah.
There's so much there in terms of social and cultural history.
And environmental history too. I mean, right now I'm obsessed with marbled murrelets, which are these birds that feed quite far out in the ocean, but they nest high in old growth forests. And it was only in the 1970s that scientists discovered where these birds actually nest. And so there's this interpenetration of the marine and terrestrial environments. And we can think about salmon, hauling all those nutrients up into the forest with their bodies. So these are and people going out whaling and from the coast and all that. So it's a very kind of porous space.
Right. And multi-directional.
That's right. And multidimensional.
Yeah, amazing. So hundreds of years ago, when I did railroad work, in the 19th century, when railroads would wreck, it was seen to be so astonishing that the technology would let people down, that they became these tourist sites immediately, that people just scrambled all over the wrecks. Did the same thing happen with the shipwrecks?
Absolutely. The one behind me, the Peter Iredale, there are tons of photos of it lying there with its masts broken, and, cars and buggies and horses and people taking their photos, people riding their bicycles and taking photos. There's a great photo of kind of a bathing beauty from 1959, sort of perched on a convertible in front of it. So that's one of the things I'm interested in. And there's a thing that happens, I think, across the 20th century, where these sites become sites of memory. And kind of longing for a mythic past, at the same time that most of settler society retreats from the ocean. And so the ocean becomes the world of container shipping and this kind of internationalized space that most of us don't have any concrete connection with at all.
Yeah, internationalized space, and also just thinking about the container vessels dwarfing the human scale so much. I mean, I look at the wreck behind you and I can imagine Mets clamoring over that when it was actually active, but it must be a concept of the ocean now belongs to these behemoths.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I'm looking there to folks like Alan Sekula, who have done a lot of work on kind of late capitalism and container shipping, and how that changes our sense of space and scale. Because it's not that the ocean isn't part of our lives anymore, it's just that we can function as though it's not.
Exactly. So you'd mentioned as we started our talk that these sites or these wrecks had fascinated you even as a kid. Tell us a little bit about that. Was that like an interest in marine archaeology, or did they just the notion that they're out there kind of captivate you?
Well, to be honest, it was kind of just morbid curiosity, which I think is an largely undeveloped piece of historical consciousness. And
I plead
yeah,
guilty
so
on
I mean,
that. Yeah,
yeah,
I
right.
have that too. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I grew up loving, cemeteries and ghost stories and all this kind of stuff, right? And so the opening of the book is about a memory I have, one of my earliest memories of razor clamming down on the Washington coast in an area where there was a wreck from 1965 just sitting on the beach there, an old passenger liner. And just that is seared in my mind as this space that there's a history here. And, no one died. It was just a capsized boat that, its line parted and it got washed ashore. So it's nothing that dramatic, but it tapped into some sort of almost archetypal kind of thing that's been in my head for 40 years, 50 years
Amazing.
now.
Yeah, amazing. It must feel kind of exciting to revisit your youthful curiosity.
Yeah, it really is. And it's a chance to sort of investigate, I think, why we become historians a little bit. And my career has largely been about wrestling with what does it mean to have an allegiance to a place that is not historically mine. And so this is another chance to kind of do some of that work and think about how do we relate to this place.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Just thinking back my own boyhood in Colorado, ghost towns had such a hold on me that
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure somewhere in one's becoming what one does, the power of that past is important. So these are ghost towns off the coast, aren't they?
Yeah, they really are. And I am interested in ghost stories associated with them. There's a wreck in 1906 called the Valencia where a couple hundred people died and on the coast of Vancouver Island. And for years afterwards, people would claim to see the Valencia in the exhaust of other ships. And there were rumors of lifeboats filled with skeletons found in caves on the coast and things like this.
Wow.
So it's just exceptionally evocative material
Yeah,
to write about.
I can imagine. And just at the kind of taxonomic, pointy-headed way in which we all work, are you cataloging as many of them as you can in terms of, bills of lading and who captained them and who was on board and that kind of thing?
A lot of that work has been done. I mean, that's one of the good things about tapping into maritime history is that there is a very powerful, largely outside of academia, community of researchers who keep track of all of that kind of material. And I'm really grateful for those guys, and most of them are guys. And I'm doing something that's a little bit more cultural history, where I'm less trying to be comprehensive and more illustrative or illuminative in terms of, these ships are both metaphors and metonyms for these larger processes. They are the thing itself. They're not just metaphors. I mean, but they're also powerful metaphors. And
Yeah.
when the Titanic, the Onion created a book a few years ago called Our Dumb Century, and one of their headlines having to do with the Titanic was "World's Largest Metaphor Sinks." And shipwrecks are like that. People invest a lot of time, energy, money, and narrative energy in these kinds of spaces, and so that's what I'm interested in pulling apart.
Yeah, it's just, it's so fascinating to be an historian of the American West these days because, at least in my era, we were trained so terrestrially, and the Overland Trail and the Gold Rush kind of had pride of place about terrestrial
Yeah,
conquest. But the last 20 years or so, the realization that, just as you say, the Pacific is so integral
yeah.
into the settler colonial patterns of the West, it's just a really exciting dimension of the work.
Yeah, and there's people doing good stuff. I mean, I'm thinking about people like Dorothy Fujita-Roni, David Chang, Sean Fraga, who just finished his PhD recently,
Yeah.
looking at the terra aqueous West. And
Yeah, he's come to join us at USC.
oh, good,
Yeah, as a
good,
postdoc. Yeah. Yeah.
good. Yeah, so there's a lot of good work happening. I think Josh Reed's "The Sea Is My Country" is a brilliant model for a lot of this kind of work, and so it's really exciting to see, to see us breaking the bonds of just the terrestrial.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Do you imagine? I mean, I read your abstract for Rect. You this is like a ideal senior seminar or a small seminar for your students. Do you teach it as a course?
I haven't yet, but I'm going to be teaching a course in summer of 2022 at the Vancouver Maritime Museum, where I'll actually be working with the collections. It's just like 6 blocks from where I'm sitting. And we'll be working with the collections. They've told us we can go out on boats. They'll take us out on boats and do that because I do want to have an experiential element to this. Just like with my London book, I took students to London twice for 2-week trips called In Search of Indigenous London. And having that kind of pedagogical material experience, I think, is a really important part of my writing process.
Oh, it's wonderful. No, and it could be life-changing for your students.
Yeah, for sure. For
Yeah.
sure.
You mentioned, I think, at the beginning of our chat that there's, did you say 2,000 to 3,000 wrecks?
Mm-hmm.
So that differential's pretty large. Is it just unknown?
There are a lot of ships that just went missing and nobody knows what happened to them, which I find pretty fascinating as a category in and of itself, that I want to write into a bit. It sort of depends on how you're defining things geographically, what you include. Do you include things up in Hecate Strait going to the Haida Gwaii, the Queen Charlotte Islands? What about Northern California? So that's where it gets a little blurry. And then also in the earlier records, they're just not kept very well. And what counts as a ship? Is it, a small fishing boat on the Columbia Bar, or is it, a big tanker, or what? So it's not a number that I'm that committed to getting nailed down specifically.
Right. So the Columbia Bar reminds me, is that a boundary in the sense of for your work? So if they make it past the bar and then wreck upstream somewhere, that's a different bailiwick.
Yeah, I've had to think about that because there were, paddle wheelers and things on the Willamette and the Columbia that wrecked and burned and things, and I'm leaving those out. And I'm also not worried about the interior waters. So like the wreck of the Beaver here in Vancouver, or the Mosquito Fleet in Seattle, or whatever, I'm not too worried about those. It's really just this open outer coast, and the whole idea of the concept of the graveyard of the Pacific, which by the early 20th century was a phrase that people were using. I'm interested in that as a concept.
Absolutely. So as we're sort of coming to the end here, but I have a question that's based on the work of one of my own graduate students who's at work on the great storms, the atmospheric river storms of 1861-62 up and down the Pacific. Have you encountered those as a cause of some wrecks?
Not yet, but I imagine once I get into it a bit more, I wouldn't be surprised. And right now, a lot of my reading is focused on oceanography. So I'm thinking about upwellings and, currents and Gulf streams and all this kind of stuff. And again, it's a way for me as a writer to get inside the more than human aspects of this story. So I'd love to know more about that, because
absolutely. I'll connect you to him, because what he's determined is what we thought were episodic moments of a very wet winter in 61-62. He's created a necklace of their effects all the way from Baja up through BC.
Wow.
Yeah, so just encountering this remarkable winter of the deluge and the social history and cultural history that it left in its wake.
Yeah, I love that stuff. And in the Pacific Northwest is, with some notable exceptions, has been a region that's largely been unexplored by historians, at least in the academic sense. There's a lot of great local community-based and sort of antiquarian history that's happened, but in terms of more analytical stuff, it's a region that's incredibly rich and still has a lot of work to be done.
That is tantalizing. That's a great way to end what we're talking about, because it's a way for you, both of us, to remind younger scholars about the growth field of this kind of work.
Yeah, and just to make an invitation that I'd love to hear from people who are doing that kind of work. I'd love to know what's out there. So
that's terrific, Coll. Well, congratulations on the leave, and the project just sounds endlessly fascinating. So best of luck with it, and thanks very, very much.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.